Hi there, and welcome to this Explaining History video. And this is for anyone that's studying the Soviet Union under Stalin and particularly collectivization. So, collectivization as a policy begins in 1928. There is a trip that Stalin takes to the Urals in 1927, where he experiments in Siberia with a form of collectivization, and he tours the region to see if it's working. And there are already indications at that time how brutal collectivization will be. So collectivization is the state control of land, the requisitioning by the state of farmland, of equipment and of livestock, and the dissolving of individual farming plots into one homogeneous block of land that can be farmed, in Stalin's view, industrially. Why did this happen? Well, firstly, Stalin was attempting to deal with what he saw as a historic problem. Stalin saw that the Soviet Union was weak. The Soviet Union had been crippled by the Russian Civil War. The towns and cities were not industrializing rapidly enough because workers didn't have access to cheap food, and because the levels of grain exports that were required to bring machinery into the country were too low. So what do you need to do? Well, you need to deal with the age-old problem of unproductive Russian agriculture. You need to make sure that the Russian peasant is producing large amounts of surplus grain. Surplus grain means cheap food, and it means exports. And these things are the factors that had powered industrial revolutions in many other parts of the world up until that point. If this doesn't happen, if you don't have an industrial revolution, the Soviet Union is done for in Stalin's view. The Soviet Union is surrounded by hostile powers, enemies, capitalist states that will inevitably try to overthrow communism. The British, the Americans, the French, the Japanese, none of them had immediate plans to do anything of the sort. But in Stalin's worldview, he said, well, what happened during the Russian Civil War? We were invaded on numerous fronts by powers that explicitly wanted to overthrow the Bolshevik state. And also, Stalin was very suspicious of countries like Finland and Poland and the Baltic states along the Soviet borders, and he believed that they were kind of Western patsies, if you will, Western proxy states that would be the ones who would really lead the war against communism. At this point, the Soviet state is nowhere near as powerful as it was at the end of the Second World War, and could quite easily have been challenged by states along its borders. So Stalin believed that this industrialization needed to happen rapidly. So what you need to do is, as mentioned, you need to boost the amount of grain that is produced. Stalin thinks that the way you do this is, instead of allowing individual peasant farms to individual peasant villages to allot land in the kind of rather chaotic and arcane way that they used to, or to prevent the rise of the kulak class that I'll talk about in a moment, you must essentially nationalize land, livestock, tools, and labor. And start to farm in a kind of a mass industrial manner. The idea was eventually that the collective farms would be so big that you could introduce what economists call economies of scale, putting all the fields together and using tractors. Of course, when it comes to it, the Soviet state is not efficient enough, well managed enough, or organized enough to make sure that there are abundant tractors to supply farms. One of the dilemmas that Stalin has is he thinks, if we allow a little bit of capitalism into the countryside, peasants selling their grains at the marketplace for prices that the market dictates, that might feed people, but then it starts to create an enemy social class, a class of little capitalists they will eventually, these kulaks, these wealthy peasants, will eventually create their own kulak party, because this is what, from a Marxist-Leninist perspective, this is what little capitalists do. They eventually create their own political force, and that will challenge the Bolshevik regime. So the danger is that by allowing small level capitalism to feed people, you then create the seeds of the doom of the regime. And that can't be allowed. So the capitalist route, the low-level capitalist route, that has to be kind of wiped out. And instead, you need a state-directed, a statist approach. And here is where it involves immense amounts of violence, because you have to force the peasants and the kulaks into something that they really don't want to do. Stalin used, long before collectivization, the tensions within peasant villages between wealthier peasants and mildly wealthy peasants and very poor peasants, and the resentments there, to turn the poor peasants on the wealthy ones and to create social discord within villages, to try to chip away at the power of what he saw as this very big and dangerous social class. Much of this was a figment of kind of frightened Bolshevik imaginations. And the result eventually is that when the kulaks resist collectivization, Stalin has his opportunity to say, you see, I told you so. They are actually enemies, they are actually dangerous, and now we really must act, we really must do something. And then Stalin, and this is by 1932, around that time, argues that there is a definitive enemy to kind of wage war on. And here we go from collectivization into what was referred to as the dekulakization campaigns, which involved mass arrests, immense amounts of state violence, mass incarceration in the Gulag system. And those peasants that emerged from the Gulag system, those kulaks that emerged from the Gulag system around 1937 or so, are the ones to be wound up in the Great Purges, or to be executed within the camp system themselves, because once their names were on a list of kind of class enemies, they rarely came off. So there's the kind of the underpinnings, the secret thinkings of Stalin and his inner circle about the necessity for collectivization from the late 1920s through to the mid-1930s. I hope you found this useful. Do remember to subscribe to the channel, check out all the other things we've got here, because I'm trying to put a lot of things on here for students. So if you're answering an essay on this subject, just remember there are a couple of key points here. Firstly, that Stalin believed that the Soviet Union was under threat, that industrialization would save it from that threat, and the way you get to industrialization is by seizing the surplus grain that peasants produced. Thanks very much, all the best, bye-bye.